On the mask issue, by not wearing a mask the other night, although you've apologized, by not wearing a mask, by asking demonstrators to hold hands with such a large group, as worthy as the cause was, and though most of them were wearing masks, what do you say to people who are watching at home, growing increasingly frustrated at certain things they can't do? They've heard you say these are the rules for the past few months, and now may think most of those have gone out the window, and now may be thinking, to heck with it, I'm done.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. So look, it was clearly a mistake on my part. I shouldn't have done it, and it's just another note that we have to be vigilant. The rules are there to keep us all healthy. I will say this, had I attended the protest and been there for an hour or two, certainly I would have worn a mask. I am extremely careful wearing masks, washing my hands, social distancing. The fact that I didn't in that split second is just an indication of I felt it was kind of an emergency. When I got the call to get down there, I just flew down the hill to do my part to escalate a tense situation. So not an excuse, to be sure. We all need to follow the rules, myself included, and I intend to do that. But in that moment of urgency, I forgot, and, no excuse.
To follow up on that, Governor, the word seemed to be going around that you might make an appearance, and it seemed like nobody who was with you had a mask. And shouldn't it be on you at all times?
Yeah, no, it's true. I shouldn't laugh. It wasn't planned. I didn't go to the protest, even though I was hugely supportive, because, as I said, it was in direct conflict with the social distance. The gathering limit is still 15. Right? That's the rule that everyone should be following, including myself. I have been following. But I have to say, like that day, people worked so hard, the protest organizers included, to make that be an effective, peaceful demonstration. And at that moment, I guess like about 9 o'clock, when the colonel and the general called me and suggested that maybe my presence could play a role in de-escalating, I just answered the call and got down there as fast as I could. So it wasn't, and I was only there for a few minutes, right? I was just there long enough to try to play a role in keeping a lid on what could have been a tense situation. So the answer is yes, I should have. I didn't. It's a lesson learned, and it's a note that we can all be better.
Governor, there's a couple from Cranston that has spent the better part of the last 2 years planning a wedding on Block Island. Challenging in normal times, so they've been following your directives as things have evolved. Their event planner, who they've been working with, contacted DVR with a plan, with Department of Health. They both checked off, said everything's fine.
Okay, good.
For some reason, it went to Commerce. Commerce said you can't do this. And the reason was because it was interpreted as a gathering, as opposed to what restaurants can do. Now, this couple has made concessions. They got rid of the open bar. They have 100 people coming. It's on an 8-acre property, you can imagine. Yeah. They're all spread out, tables of 10 to 15, and Commerce calls it a gathering.
Yeah.
So given what happened, I'm sorry?
Do you know when it is?
The date is July 4th. I'd be happy to provide you the July 4th.
Okay, so listen, yes, happy to get me the information. This is a super tough call. Here's the deal with weddings. If it's in a place of worship, then you abide by the 25% occupancy in that place of worship. Beyond that, if it's in this phase 2, we have tried to say that events have to abide by the number 15 for social gatherings. And then in July, we're going to expand that, and I hope to be out, I can't remember if it's this Friday or next Monday, that I'll be providing more guidance. So if the short answer to these people is they're probably going to be able to go through with it because it's in July. If it were in June, then we are asking people to continue to abide by the 15.
Remember planning your own wedding. You can't say maybe.
Yeah.
People have booked hotel rooms 2 years ago. The groom's father lives in Florida.
Yeah.
He needs an answer now. So I have a couple of questions. And then they look at what happened across the street. 10,000 people. These
Yeah,
people are trying
I
to
hear
do
that.
everything by the book. So why can't, in that setting, so then the other question is, why is Commerce even involved in this?
Yeah, so
when
this-
DVR and DOH,
Yeah.
which is calling the shots,
Approved it.
approved it, and then they got, and so if it's not my coming to you, and this affects a lot of people on Block Island, Newport, they're all looking at this case to say, what do we do?
Yeah.
There's ambiguity.
Yeah, so first of all, you make a very fair point. Second of all, I will give clearer guidance later this week on weddings, because you're right. I don't feel comfortable getting into the middle of this. It sounds like it was a mistake.
They need guidance now.
Well, I'll get to them then. I don't know what happened. All I can tell you is what I've already said. In phase 2, social gatherings are limited to 15. If it's a wedding in a church, it can be 25%. Yeah, I don't know, Bill.
But why would Commerce be involved?
Because that's their job. You know, Commerce, it's clear that there's some miscommunication in this, and I'll own that. These people are working very hard and fast. There's thousands of different scenarios. It's not an excuse. But Commerce is the one that is DBR reports to Commerce.
What about the Department of Health? They're running the show here. When I asked months ago about DOH versus on the high school graduations, who's calling the shots, RIDE or the Department of Health? You were following guidelines from the Department of Health.
Yes, we are. And those guidelines are online on reopeningri.com. What you are highlighting is clearly a miscommunication and something we have to address.
Governor,
So I'll get to those people today.
Thank you.
not a coronavirus question, but related to the protest that you attended on Friday. Many people were calling to defund police. The Minneapolis City Council is now saying that's something that they're considering in their city. Would you support a local city or town if they decided to defund their local police department here?
First, let me say that would, of course, be up to the city and town, and I don't want to overreach into what any city or town wants to do. If you were to ask me the same question about the state police, I would say no. No, I don't think that's the right answer. I think clearly we have a lot more work to do to stamp out fully, completely racism, racial profiling, police brutality in all of its forms. And I think that, and we have to get to the business of continuing to do that. And there's no one thing. I don't think defunding is the answer. I think it's better training, nonviolence training, a more diverse leadership and strategy for recruiting diversity. You know, one thing which I support, body cameras, that actually takes more money. So I don't think it's an answer to, I don't think the answer is defunding, and I don't think the data would suggest that fewer cops leads to greater safety. Having said that, I'm not saying everything's perfect. I think we have to look at some of the other things I've said.
Well, Governor, when the proposal is to defund the police, that's something of a slogan, not really intended literally. The idea, as proposed, as I understand it anyway, is that we often call upon the police to do things that are not effectively done by the police. To give a simple example, we have the war on drugs, where we've taken what one could say is a medical problem and criminalized it. So we treat, say, addiction to opioids very different than we treat, say, addiction to alcohol. And the idea here is that the money we've been spending on that, because to send somebody to prison costs more than to send them to an Ivy League college. So the idea is that the money we've been spending on those kinds of things, the police, the courts, the criminal justice system, all of it, are effectively spent very inefficiently in those kinds of areas.
Now that I support. Last year I put before the legislature a proposal, which they chose not to move on, which was reducing the size of the ACI. A couple of years ago, I put forth sweeping legislation to change probation and parole to make it fairer. I absolutely think we need more resources to help formerly incarcerated people get jobs, job coaches, job training, education. Some of the other things that you're saying, that I support completely. But the question that was posed to me was defunding, and that I don't support.
So would you be willing to move some of the funds that are currently going to police into the health services to help people? I mean, right, because that would be what it was, reallocation of resources from the police to health for things like drugs or other types of interventions?
I'm not, look, I would support greater funding of those areas, right? So greater funding for affordable housing, greater funding for job training and education. You mentioned the opioid. You know, one of the most successful initiatives that we have, we call the HOPE initiative, it's with the state police, where if you're found to have overdosed, they don't put you in jail. They help get you to a hospital. They help get you to a doctor. I think the first governor in America that did medical-assisted treatment of folks who are addicted while they are in prison. So I am absolutely in favor of pushing. I would love to have the legislature's support on my proposal to reduce funding for our prisons and to reallocate that to training for people in the prison or health care or more medical-assisted treatment. So, yes.
Governor, I was there Friday night, and you and the first gentleman did de-escalate the situation, without question. But I don't know if we do a service by giving this impression everyone it was a peaceful rally. I saw you speak Thursday with the clergy. Now, that was a peaceful rally. Mm-hmm. I was there. There were people screaming vulgarity at the police and the National Guard. Mm-hmm. There were vulgar signs. An officer was assaulted, 9 people arrested, and what seems to be left out is, had you and the first gentleman not showed up, there were people ready to clash with the Guard. Mm-hmm. Can we agree this term of peaceful protest, had your presence not come, who knows how long that would have gone or how that would have ended up?
Yeah. I appreciate you saying that. I think really the credit goes to the folks who organized it and the state police and National Guard and the leadership. But you're not incorrect. Look, there were 10,000 people there for hours, and that was very peaceful. You know, for hours, it was beautiful. It was a peaceful, everyone had their mask on. They were peaceful for hours, 10,000 people taking a stand. Later in the evening, and I unfortunately, or whatever, I chose to opt out of that because of my own public health guidance. You're correct, though, that as the hours went on, I think, 9,000 people went home. The organizer, God bless her, a young woman, got up there and said, we've had a great rally, we've had a great protest, it's time to go home. And most people went home. Later in the evening, though, it was a very different scene. You're correct. It was a much more tense, angry,
They wanted to get arrested.
Potentially violent. Yeah. There were definitely some agitators there who were stirring up the crowd. And that's the only reason I showed up, because I was after all the great work that went into making that peaceful, I was going to do anything I could to keep the peace. And maybe I played a small role in that. And if I did, I'm happy I did it.
Do you make the first gentleman wear that shirt?
I do not.
Right.
Stop it.
On a serious note, we've learned now the FBI is looking into last Monday night. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, that is true. We are working every single day with federal authorities to try to figure out who did it and hold them accountable. We still don't know exactly who did it, but man, we're going to work as hard as we can.
FBI Boston is what I mean.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes. Okay. Yeah, we're working with the FBI. We're working with our Attorney General, state police, we're collaborating with other state police and Attorney General and the U.S. Attorney. Absolutely. We've made a handful of arrests. We're going to continue to make arrests the more that we learn. But we don't know yet exactly who did it.
Just one more thing. People that were there told me, all seriousness, the first gentleman was soothing, calm. What did he say to you, as we've got to know him from being, what did he say to you when the two of you walked out of there?
So it really wasn't planned at all. I got the call and they said, Gov, if you come down, we think it could help. So I ran out the door, and they said, but you got to come now. So I flew out the door and Andy just followed me. I think he was afraid. It was not a comfortable moment.
But I meant on the way home. Did he say anything like, you owe me or anything?
Oh, no, we didn't really talk on the way home. We were shaken up by the whole thing. He probably thinks I'm a little crazy, but he knew that when he married me.
Last question, I think that's okay.
Oh.
Governor, some people are pointing out, if you can have testing for thousands of people who went to protests,
Yeah.
why not if somebody wants to have a wedding later this summer or something like that, it could be allowed if they can go get testing after.
Okay, I'm glad you asked that question. So let me say a few things. Just because you get tested doesn't make you immune from the disease. Please make that point. If you get tested and you find out you're sick, you go into isolation, you prevent someone else from getting sick. But it is not it doesn't mean you're forever immune. You still have to wash your hands, stay 6 feet away, and the whole thing. I've always been a little bit reluctant, actually, to provide so much testing because it gives people a false sense of security. Look, I hear people being frustrated. If they can do that, why can't I do this? The protests were in clear violation of the gathering. Having said that, I'm not sure what the alternative was. I was in, the direction that I gave to the Guard and the state police was de-escalate, de-escalate, de-escalate. We didn't want violence. We didn't want to have to hold people back. So I don't think it's equivalent to compare a wedding to this protest at a moment of national unrest. These rules stink. It stinks. Like, to answer Bill, like if I were a bride, it would be frustrating. It stinks for us, my kids, everybody. It's frustrating. But look, we're in a good place because we followed the rules.
Governor, you said yourself that we're not seeing a spike in cases associated with some of the larger gatherings on Memorial Day. What does it mean, and maybe this is a better question for Dr. Alexander Scott, what will it mean if in 2 weeks from Friday we are not seeing a massive spike in cases associated with these thousands of people having gathered?
It's something that we are concerned about, but as has been mentioned, we were pleased with our staff being there and the folks who peacefully participated. There was a high coverage of wearing facial coverings of some sort. And so if there is not a spike, it will be reassuring that it works. When you wear a mask, when you wear a cloth face covering, do your best to stay 6 feet apart. It was definitely challenging, but also have access to hand sanitizer, stay within small groups where you can, don't overmingle with multiple different sets of people. That can make a difference. And that's what we believe we are seeing as part of why there is an increase as of yet. It requires us to continue to watch, to continue to be vigilant, but it is encouraging for people to know that when you wear your masks, when you follow these rules, it works. And there's always that risk profile. If you let up on certain things, there's going to be more of a risk. But we can say, and our team was there making sure everyone who didn't had masks, we offered it to law enforcement too, where we could, that the overwhelming number of peaceful participants had masks on. And so we are hopeful that it will help in minimizing the types of spikes that are possible to occur across the country.
But doctor, wouldn't the likelihood of an outbreak resulting from the demonstrations be in significant part a consequence of whatever the prevalence is in the population, which we don't know and have been trying to measure? I mean, Trevor Bedford, the epidemiologist, just published an analysis over the weekend that's getting a lot of attention, where he figured that there might be about 3,000 additional infections nationally as a result of these demonstrations. And if that's the case, he referred to it as a back-of-the-envelope calculation, but he's assuming that the prevalence is probably about 0.5%, very low in terms of the general population, obviously much higher in some areas than others. But if that's the case, then the probability of a significant outbreak as a result of the demonstration would also be rather low. Of course, he's also making the observation that the reason we would have low prevalence like that is because of the effectiveness of, say, the governor's stay-at-home order issued very early in this process. But we can't know where that's going to go. I don't think.
So there are a number of things that you just asked. What I shared with Kim is one of the elements that we are hopeful will make a difference. We know that wearing some form of cloth face covering, particularly when you're in close contact for a period of time, works. And we want to make sure that that message is still there. Certainly it is encouraging that, as the governor has shared, we have 3% positivity noted with expanded testing. That helps relay that we are doing the job needed to identify people who have symptoms and are diagnosed with or identified as having COVID-19, getting them into isolation and getting their contacts quarantined. That is encouraging for saying that what occurred also is a part of hopefully not having as much of a spike, because we know 3% were tested. That being said, we do know what we are seeing in certain communities throughout the state where there is more density amongst the population. And what we saw over the weekend was the definition of a more dense population. So we definitely need to be vigilant. We definitely want to make sure that people continue to wear cloth face coverings, because it does make a difference. And now we're among the first states that is offering testing for people who have attended, so that, as the governor mentioned, it is one point in time, so that we can identify the people who are positive, get them isolated, and get their quarantines contacted. We want to emphasize that it's not, if you had a negative result, that's going to be true for all of us, we still need to be just as vigilant, because the test does not work as well in people who do not have symptoms. So it's really only helpful in this targeted situation as a part of our overall strategy for identifying those who are positive, so that we can do what's needed to stop transmission.